Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our third evening exploring the subject of science and religion. Thanks for those who could make it to the church, and thanks for those who are viewing online. So to begin, I just want to outline the structure of this evening. So we're going to begin, as we've done in the past two evenings, with an audience poll. As this is the third evening on this topic, I want to have a look back, a brief revision of what we looked at in the first two evenings. And a closer look at the previous polls, which are quite characteristic and specific for this parish. A short look at the subject, the controversial subject of scientific atheism. So I want to explore with you the controversies, and then after that, attempt to point a way forward. How do we get out of the controversy? How do we get out of the difficulty? A brief case study on science and better stewardship. Science can help faith, as well as faith helping science, and I want to look at it in both directions. Then finally, some key takeaway messages, a final poll, and then a panel discussion and some questions. And with that in mind, if you have questions, you can visit the Slido website, enter the event code that's listed on the slide here, and that will take you into the poll and will take you into the questions. So please think of your questions from now, in fact. So let's begin by looking at the poll. This is rather more personal, rather more specific. So which statements best describes your personal view? Science is never in conflict with your religious beliefs. It's sometimes in conflict with your religious beliefs, or it is mostly in conflict with your religious beliefs. We'll take a minute to do that, and then I'm going to invite Paul to give us the results.
Okay, so far we have 10, 11 people voting, so we'll leave it a little bit longer.
Yeah.
Just a reminder that the Slido code is 55303. It's very easy. When do you want me to go, John?
Oh, let's go, Paul. Yeah.
Okay, then. So far, at the moment, we have 46% saying science never conflicts with my religious beliefs, and now it's changed to 43%, and 60% now say science sometimes conflicts with my religious beliefs. So 40 never, 60 sometimes.
And none for the final question.
None for mostly.
All right, so that fits in very much with surveys that have been done in the US, and I want to go on by showing you another slide. That's from our last evening, which is the question, do you think science and religion are in harmony, or are in increasing conflict, or don't know, or I'm undecided? So of 66 people, 48% thought there was conflict. And one of my missions in doing these lectures is to convince you that there is really no cause for conflict, and much of the time there isn't conflict. Much of that is perception, driven by sometimes by the media, and sometimes with people who have an axe to grind. So a second question, I think, I just want to compare with this survey that I mentioned at the last lecture, which was done by the Pew Research Institute in the US in 2015. Do you think science and religion are compatible or are often in conflict? And again, very similar to what we're taking from the surveys here. Most people feel that there's often conflict between the two. And just to show you a slide I've shown, that's that slide, just to show you and just to show you where that conflict is coming from very often, I mentioned last week, it's Galileo, of course, the famous Galileo story. It's the story of evolution and the perception that evolution and faith and creation are opposed, which is also not quite true. The creation of the universe, the Big Bang theory, for instance, and sometimes it's general, it's not specific, it's rather about people's general lack of belief or belief in God, for example. And then there's a myriad other range of topics like stem cell research, medical treatments, etc., etc., etc. So there are many drivers of the perception of conflict. And I showed you this report by Gallup, I think in the first evening, which was a study in the US on evolution and creation. Now, the way the question was set up, of course, was almost designed to create the perception of conflict. But a large number of people in the US actually believed that they did not believe in evolution and believed that God had created the earth in the past 10,000 years. So this is what's called New Earth creationism. Not a position of the Catholic Church, because as I said last week, the important point to make is that the Church's position is evolution and creation. Both are compatible and both can be complementary worldviews. So moving on to yet another survey, and this was one that we did here as well last week, last evening. Which one of the following do you think is true? So of 39 people, 21% felt that Galileo was right and the church was wrong, but the majority felt that there was fault on both sides, which of course is the correct answer. But the idea that 1 in 5 believes that Galileo was right and the church was wrong, I think is a view that's seen and perpetrated very often in the media and in the press. It's a false view. It's not borne out by analysis, and that's what I did during the course of the last lecture. Moving on to, again, yet another question that we had here, and that was to select what you believe to be the degree of DNA similarity. And again, most people got it right. It's 99% of people, 55% of people actually believe that there's 99% of compatibility between the two genomes of the chimpanzee and indeed the human. And this is the correct answer. And yet, as I said at the last lecture, we're the ones studying the chimps and writing papers about it. So a 1% difference, and yet we are the ones with the intellect and the ability to study other species and actually write about that and analyze it. We move on to, again, the people's point of view on whether science and religion are in different domains and should keep apart, whether science and religion, while separate, have complementarity and therefore should be united in trying to improve the human condition, and then finally, science and religion as overlapping but needing to be working together. And again, very strong majority there in favor of the second option. And this is one of the more controversial areas, and I want to show you the results of another survey, and that was again Pew in the US, who, and it shows the split between the different points of view. It's almost split 50-50 between those who say the church should express its views and those who say the church should keep out and should not express its views. And that's a theme I want to come back to because I think it's very important, a really fundamental importance. Keep apart or help each other. In the same survey, of course, there were many questions, but one of the questions was about views on global warming, which is somewhat of concern for scientists, because while most people in the survey, 50%, said they believed in the science that demonstrated human activity causing climate change, 25% believed there was no evidence for climate change, global warming, and about 23% said that these are due to natural effects, despite the science. So when we talk about people having difficulty believing in God, people are having difficulty believing in science, believe it or not. It's the same problem, different aspects of the same problem, you could argue. When the evidence is there, it's still not accepted. So, moving on. And I want to go in now to looking back again in a little bit more detail at some of the topics I visited last week, without going into too much technical jargon, but we heard about the Big Bang Theory. And this is a representation of that phenomenon. So 14 billion years ago, there was an event that created the universe as we know it. I mentioned that one of the key players in this was Monsignor Georges Lemaitre, who was a Belgian priest. So clergymen played their part in some of the science that brings about this. Some people don't like the Big Bang Theory because it points to a creation event, a starting point, a beginning. But one of the reasons I'm showing you the slide is that it starts with a very, very small space, size of a grapefruit, huge amount of energy, and over billions of years, the creation of stars, galaxies, and our own planet and solar system. The actual pathway between the Big Bang itself and where we are now is a very narrow path indeed. And it was Georges Lemaitre's work that looked at the rate of expansion of the universe, because it has expanded and is continuing to expand. But the margin in terms of the probabilities, number one, if it was greater than 1 part in a million different, the gravity wouldn't have been strong enough to pull the stars together. We wouldn't be here. And if it was less than 1 part in 100,000 million, we wouldn't have been here, because the whole thing would have collapsed again. So the key theme on this slide is this narrow path that brought us from that Big Bang event to being here. It's very narrow. You could argue it's very improbable. It's one of the key mysteries that science has not been able to answer. Why did it end up with us being here? And many scientists will look at this and say, well, it's there because it's there, and it's always been there. Well, it hasn't always been there. It hasn't always been there like this. So that brings me then to the whole idea of the anthropic principle. And there was a question on this last week, so I decided to put a slide in and to deal with it in a little bit more detail. The key point here is that the observable universe that we see has a structure that permits the existence of observers. We're here, so we see it. And the key question, of course, is why is this universe just right for life? We simply don't know. It's a question that science can't answer. Some people have suggested that there might be parallel universes in which there is no life and therefore no observers, so we can't prove their existence one way or the other. I mentioned as well in the last lectures the mystery of why the 15 constants of nature have exactly the values they have. Again, if the constants were not what they are, we wouldn't exist. It all fits together very well. And again then, from an intellectual point of view, why is the universe comprehensible to us? Why have we been gifted the intellect to understand it, or at least understand it partially? There's another interesting mystery as well, and that is around the language of mathematics. And I've put in here the Fibonacci numbers, which appear repeatedly in nature. You may have heard of the golden ratio, for example, which Leonardo da Vinci captured in his famous image of man. But why is the language of mathematics so well suited to describing the universe? And why is there so much harmony? And ultimately, science has not provided the answers to any of these questions. It's quite remarkable. Now that brings me then to yet another idea. Well, first of all, let me just, and what I'm doing this evening as well, I'm bringing in some thoughts from the Catechism, because I think the Catechism has some useful guiding phrases and statements on this topic. And I want to use the second one. First of all, the truth is beautiful in itself, and I think the universe is beautiful, as is the truth. But the second point is that the humble and persevering investigator, the scientist, investigating the secrets of nature, is being, as it were, led by the hand of God, in spite of himself, for it's God that reveals what things are and how they were made. So all the time, we have to think of what's guiding us to this point. And that brings me then to a perspective from yet another angle, and that is teleological. Teleology comes from the Greek, meaning aim, end, objective, or goal. And it's used often to discuss purpose and the idea of supernatural planning. It refers to a preordained plan that can either exist outside of an object or inside of an object. For example, an egg knowing what it's going to become, ultimately. But it's somewhat controversial, especially in the sciences. And it's used less in the scientific literature these days than it was in the past. But the key question I want to ask here on this slide is, why is it that some biological solutions are so perfect when you drill into the details? When we have the panel discussion, before the panel discussion, I'll introduce Carmen, and she's going to tell a brief story about her experience in biology, and especially about photosynthesis. But there are some fantastically perfect biological phenomena, and I'm showing two here. The spider's web, which everybody's familiar with strands that are stronger than most human man-made materials. And the second one is the molecule glucose. And glucose I'm a bit familiar with because glucose is our fuel. We're burning it at the moment. That's what we live on. It's what photosynthesis makes. It's what we eat. So it's very important. But of all the sugars that could have been chosen for the purpose of fuel, this is the best one because it's not very reactive. It forms a ring, which you see here on the slide. The ring is very stable. It sits in a very stable molecular conformation, and it's the best sugar for doing the job that it's doing. I think it's remarkable. And the more we drill into that, into detail, the more we discover how elegant that molecule is for its job. And so we look around nature, and nature has done such a good job that often now you see these products that are advertised as inspired by nature, because nature being the ultimate perfection. We can't do better very often. The consumer knows that. So inspired by nature becomes a label of perfection very often. Now, I showed this slide last week, and of course, as a scientist, as a Christian, we look at that statement and think, well, there are things we can ask science to do, and there are things we really shouldn't be asking science to do for a number of reasons. This is one reason, because it's a commandment, it's an instruction. The second is that we simply cannot use science to answer some questions. And I've showed this slide before, because to answer a question using science, you've got to formulate a problem, you've got to formulate a testable question, and then you've got to make a hypothesis from that question. If you can't produce a testable question, science cannot be used to actually produce an answer. And what that means is that many of the questions that we come up with in terms of why we're here, questions that we might ask our faith to answer, we cannot use science to answer those questions. And this is a very important principle because many of those who practice what we would call potentially scientific atheism are not practicing science. In fact, the two words don't go together at all. So that's very important. Now, moving on to that subject, that idea of people who call themselves scientific atheists. It's a broad movement of people, but this is a quotation from one. So Peter Atkins, anybody who studied chemistry, when I studied chemistry, would have read one of Peter Atkins' books. He's a professor of physical chemistry at the University of Oxford. But his statement here is extremely strong, extremely provocative, really getting in your face, saying that he's going to take people on a journey of comprehension. And on the journey, he's saying that he's going to argue that there's nothing that cannot be understood, and there's nothing that cannot be explained. Everything is explainable, and everything is simple. It's a big promise. And this is really a form of scientism. It's a belief that science can answer every question, and nothing is beyond the limits of science. Even good scientists know that science is limited. It is limited because of what I just said about testing hypotheses. So let's have a closer look at this issue of scientism. Again, it's a belief, if you like, that reality is only limited by what science can disclose. And it sees all truths as discoverable by science, and that science, and this is the most important point, that science is the best or the only way of knowing something. As a scientist, this is not a very scientific statement in itself. And the second point here is a kind of a logical extension, this whole idea of the transhumanism, and there's a new term now called post-human. And we're seeing some of this in practice, where people are kind of connecting themselves to devices, cyber technology, etc. It's the belief that science and technology alone can enable humans to transcend their limits and attain ultimate potential. This is very dangerous and very misleading, and it's a very good thing to be optimistic and a very good thing to be ambitious, but this is a delusion, very dangerous delusion, and so we should be aware of that as well. Now, staying on the theme of what is described by the practitioners of the subject as scientific atheism, I want to take you through two books, and one is The Blind Watchmaker, if anybody's ever heard of it, by Richard Dawkins. And the Watchmaker Analogy starts in the 18th century with a clergyman, a British clergyman called William Paley. And Paley introduces this idea that somebody may be out walking and come across a beautiful watch lying on the ground. And his point is that if you find this watch, your first thought is that somebody will have designed the watch. It didn't just happen, it didn't just grow there. There was a maker of that watch. And the maker designed it, an intelligent design, if you like. He also, and this was his argument for God as creator, an intelligent creator. The watch wasn't accidental because at that time, of course, the universe looked like a watch. In early times, people actually used the stars as their watch, effectively, and the sun. So he had an analogy between the watch and the universe. He also had another argument, and that was about a telescope. If you find a telescope with many lenses in it, you might assume again that's been constructed and designed by somebody. And he then translates that to the eye, the human eye. He said, well, the parallel here is the human eye must have been designed. And therefore, that's evidence of the hand of God. Well, it was a good thought in the 18th century. But of course, Darwin came, and more science came, and in the end, we know now that the eye, it isn't that simple. there are many steps in the evolution of the eye. And I just want to, first of all, go back to the Dawkins argument against Paley. So it's an easy one to attack because it's weak scientifically. So a scientist can easily pick this apart. And Dawkins, of course, decides to take a hatchet to the Paley argument. And his first point is that the only watchmaker in nature is the blind forces of physics. So again, it's kind of another part of scientism. And his second point is that natural selection, which is blind, unconscious, automatic, that's the process by which we have life, and there's no purpose in mind. It just happened, which again, it's a nice one to throw out, but there's no evidence for this either. And then his final point is that if nature can be said to play the role of a watchmaker in nature, it's a blind watchmaker. It's doing it without purpose and without an end in sight. It just seems to happen, which is, again, very hard to accept because there's no scientific evidence for this either. So the key point is that it's easy to dismiss the scientific arguments of Paley, but it's not possible to accept either the science that Dawkins is promoting here, even though it's quite articulate and quite well put together. Dawkins comes up with this idea of a cumulative selection process. So he's building on Darwin, and he's using a neo-Darwinian argument. So I mentioned Darwin last week. And Darwin, of course, wasn't a bad guy. It was the way people used the ideas that caused the controversy more than anything else. Now, what does neo-Darwinian mean? Well, it's very interesting because neo-Darwinian is when you update Darwin's principles by adding extra layers of information. And the extra layers of information include Gregor Mendel's insights on Mendelian inheritance. And remember, Gregor Mendel was the monk who worked in Austria in the 1800s. I've also mentioned that many people didn't accept Mendel's theory. People died in Russia and from the Soviet Union because they refused to accept Mendelian inheritance. So interesting that a monk is actually being used by Dawkins to advance a point about atheism, and that the first country in the world that was established on the principles of being an atheist state had people put to death because they followed the Mendelian science at the time. Really, I find that very curious. But his idea about cumulative selection, of course, was that you have a gradual process of change, non-random, with environmental pressures, mutations taking place and changes taking place, new species arising. And then at the end of it, that bit is fine. The first bit is fine. The second bit is where it gets a little bit out of shape. And that's because he starts using computer simulations, such as the infinite monkey theorem. It's the idea, remember the old story that if you got an infinite number of monkeys and you got an infinite number of typewriters, ultimately, over many, many millions of years, they will produce the works of Shakespeare. None of us believe that. It's just a nice idea. It's very amusing. But he did a simulation where he, again, tried to argue that a gradual process of change and evolution is possible using a computer program. And he used a line from Hamlet, "Methinks it is like a weasel." And sure enough, after I think it was 43 simulations, he produces this in his program. What does that show? It doesn't show anything. It just shows that you can simulate something that changes over time. But that's a long shot, that's a long way away from the independent arrival of a species like humans. If you want to really amuse yourself on this, you can go to Microsoft, you can download a free package. It's called Microsoft Monkey Typewriter. You can put your own name in, you can put your family's name in if you want to, and you just wait while it does the simulation, and then the monkey will screech when the final answer is found. If you want to put children doing that, I'm sure we'll keep them going for a very long time. And there's another one called The Game of Life, which is a similar idea produced by the Cambridge mathematician, well, he's Cambridge and Princeton mathematician John Conway. Again, nice computer program showing replication and ongoing development of a virtual entity in a computer. It's not evidence of life. It's not evidence of evolution. It's just an amusing idea. Now, Dawkins' other book, of course, was called The Selfish Gene. And I think this is the better of his two books. It was his first book. And Dawkins is a biologist by training. That's his domain of competence, not theology. So in this particular example, it was a little bit better. However, he's still in the neo-Darwinian gene's eye point of view. Remember that inheritance, genetic inheritance, was the area developed and discovered by Gregor Mendel. So it's a gene's eye view of evolution. And his principle is that genes need organisms to exist, and that genes are selfish and use the organisms, including us, to replicate. So our purpose is, we've no purpose. The purpose is at the gene level, and that our purpose is secondary to that. And he then tries to explain altruism by explaining gene cooperation. What he does not explain, of course, is how selfish genes in our bodies end up in people that actually have selfless acts. It's just not possible. So again, these are amusing, interesting, but they're not really scientific. And Dawkins is an interesting person to read, great communicator, distinguished biologist. On the positive side, he's a strong critic of pseudoscience, which I think is a good thing. He professes belief in rigorous analysis, but he doesn't practice it. So he doesn't practice what he preaches. He's sometimes correct on many points, an enthusiastic and passionate believer in science. That's a good thing. However, he strays well outside of his domain of competence, and that's very important. Very highly selective in his use of examples and support. Certainly not always correct. Very over-optimistic. I mean, he's a promoter of scientism, over-optimistic on the power of science. Strong ego bias. Remember my first slide on my first evening on the weaknesses and the strengths and the vices and the virtues of science. Scientists are not really permitted to have egos. They're not permitted to have biases. And he's rather academic. I mean, what he's promoting here is something of an academic view, and that's fine. But it doesn't support this idea that science is the final solution to everything. I'm repeating this slide that I showed you last week on the limitations of science. And remember the story of the drunk looking for his keys under the street lamp, and he's asked why, and he tells the policeman, because I've lost my keys. And the policeman said, where are your keys? Well, I lost them in the park. Well, and he said, why are you here? I'm here because the light is here. And this is the fundamental problem. The light of science can only shine on a certain spot. And the things that are lost outside of that spot, we can't look for them under the street lamp. And even intensifying the light of science will not illuminate those dark areas outside. So doing more science won't necessarily help us there. I like the statement of Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti, where he said that the risk is that we have a single eye view on the world. A single scientific advance will be seen only with one lens for viewing a particular aspect of life, society, and the world. We need multiple lenses, and we need multiple perspectives. That's very important. And I think what the church is asking for, increasingly in the writings of the church, it has been for a long time, of course, is that multiple perspective. The need to help society by looking at things with more than one worldview. The danger is that we're being swept away by this idea that we can only look at things one way, and the rest are not relevant. Moving on to another theme I introduced last week, and this was something that the first one is non-overlapping magisteria. This idea was introduced by Stephen Jay Gould. The idea that science and faith, science and religion don't overlap. Again, it's the keep them apart idea. Alistair McGrath, on the other hand, he is also an Oxford academic, like Richard Dawkins, but he has PhDs in chemistry and in theology, introduced the idea of partially overlapping magisteria. The idea that there is an overlap, there is an idea that dialogue must happen, and that it's important that it happens. And this is I think, now the prevailing view. It's a view practiced within the Catholic Church, that it's important to bring the view of the Church to the scientific community and to receive the scientific community's perspectives and consensus as well on developments. Plenty written in the Catechism about this. And I think the key points to lift out of this slide, I don't want to read it out, but the key point to lift out is that science and technology cannot themselves disclose the meaning of existence and of human progress. That's the key point. And secondly, this idea that science often has claimed neutrality. You often see this. Science is just science, and it is neutral and doesn't have to do any more. Well, I think the Catechism's point is that it's an illusion to claim neutrality. It's important that scientific research and its applications are accountable to more than just itself. I think that's the key point there. I mentioned it last week as well, of all people, Nietzsche. Nietzsche, the philosopher who said God is dead, remember. He was never one that one might say was a friend when one was reading about philosophy and the church. However, he's quoted in Jonathan Sachs' recent book, Morality, where he supports religion and supports the churches, and by saying that nothing is needed more than the truth. And in relation to it, everything else is only of second-rate value. That includes science. So of all people, Nietzsche was arguing for an objective, independent, transcendent truth. Now, I wanted to finish this section by, again, developing that idea of the interchange between the two. So the church can provide the transcendent, objective truth to science. What can science give back? How does it work in the other direction? Well, one way in the other direction, if we look, for instance, at the word stewardship. I like the word stewardship because it's used a lot now. It's used in connection with the planet. It's used in connection with agriculture, waterways, air quality, etc., etc., etc. You see it everywhere. But it comes up in the context, in the Catechism, in the context of stewardship of animals, for instance. This is just one selected example. So God entrusted animals to the stewardship of those whom he created in his own image. And this comes into Genesis, in the first few pages of Genesis, the creation of animals, and man having the power over the animals, and the man naming those animals, etc. Now, that's a kind of a guiding principle on the top of the slide. What about the science? Well, science can actually help by guiding toward better understanding of what animal welfare looks like. So we know a lot more now, for example, about the stress on animals than we did in the past. So our standards for stewardship change because of the information that science gives us. We can't fall back and say, you know what, we can do what we want. No, we can't. We have to have regard for what is best practice stewardship. And the same applies then potentially to having choices. We don't have to eat animals every day of the week if we don't want to, because there are alternative food sources. Again, another option. And then when it comes to animal research, of course, animal research is covered in the first statement, and there's a lot written in the Catechism about that. But now we have alternatives. We have the so-called 3R tools: reduce, replace, and refine, the 3 Rs. And those tools help us to avoid unnecessary animal research. So the key point there is that we as stewards must have regard to what science says about what's good, what's best. And then it's our responsibility to take it from there. Now, moving to a future forward look, I've shown you Stephen Hawking's key point before. This is the year before he died, and he was referring to artificial intelligence when he said that we're at the most dangerous time in the development of humanity. So if ever there was a need for good dialogue between the humanities and the sciences, between the faiths and science, now is the time. We need science as well, so it's not about abandoning science, it's about making science more purposeful and more productive. One of the great challenges is the acceleration of scientific progress. I'm showing some data here on data creation. So data creation is growing exponentially, and it's expected to be 47 zettabytes in 2020. And a zettabyte is 1 million terabytes. It's a massive amount of information, massive amount of data. And so the amount of data that science and other technologies are generating now is more than humans actually can manage to process. And it's going to grow by 2035 to 2,142 zettabytes. So this is a lot of bytes. Now, in addition, we've got a huge amount of publication of scientific papers. It's about 6 papers every minute, and it's growing by 3.5% a year. It's more than people can keep up with. In the past, back in the days of Darwin and Einstein even, in the last century, people had no difficulty keeping up. Nowadays, you can't keep up with everything. You've got to be very selective and very narrow in your science. So what are the future watch-outs then coming out of that? Well, one of the watch-outs, as I've said, is that advances are happening more quickly than we can keep up with them. And this is looking at the consequences of those developments, but also potentially opportunities. Are we missing things that we should be actually grabbing? And then a pertinent question is, when the scientist or the physician, or even a lawyer, or any other profession, is an algorithm, a computer program, who's accountable? Who do you complain to? Who checks the standards? Who polices the standards? I think one of the key problems, and I said this at the last lecture, that there's over-optimism in the capacity of science to fix problems. Why don't we prevent more problems rather than fixing them? There is a prevailing view that we will, if we keep developing the science, we don't have to worry about things because we'll fix them sometime in the future. Again, this is a delusion. It's a really serious delusion. Much better to prevent, it's old philosophy, than to fix, always. And I think a very important point is the second last one here, is that much of today's scientific knowledge and application was created in a frame of a solid moral environment. That's changing. And the reason I'm saying that is, much of the scientific development was done in Christian communities, sometimes by church people, the Gregor Mendels, the George Lemaitres. They had strong moral underpinning for that. And that's changing, either because the developing economies are developing science without the moral frameworks, or because Western societies, developed economies, are losing the moral framework. And that is a bad thing. And finally, countries and societies that led for centuries scientific developments are actually falling behind. On the positive side, however, because I don't want to leave you with too many negatives, I think there is a lot of optimism and an openness to have a lot more dialogue and have that interchange between science and the faiths. So what's the way forward? Well, one takeaway, of course, is that this engagement, or the non-overlapping, this idea of the non-overlapping magisteria, is not the solution. More engagement is the key. We should look at science as a gift, actually, and we should use it responsibly. It's a wonderful gift, and it's a wonderful thing to be a scientist. But scientists need help. They need challenge, they need a critical friend, they need understanding, and they need acceptance by society, and importantly, action. There's no point in just doing the science if it's just for amusement. It needs to result in something concrete and positive at the end of it. And faith, of course, can also be informed by science, but not replaced by it. It's a two-way street. Finally, neutrality is not an option. And some key takeaway messages then for this evening and for the whole program. So the notion of conflict between faiths and science is illusory, as I've outlined and repeated. Good scientists, remember, check facts and different perspectives before making decisions, avoiding bias. Bias is the biggest sin of the scientist. And again, I'll repeat the words of Richard Feynman. You know, the two rules of science. First rule, don't fool yourself. The second rule is you're the easiest person to fool. So scientists who are fooling themselves are not good scientists. Science is not atheism, and atheism is not science. Very important not to put the two words together, because frequently they're put on the same page. And again, that's a fallacy. It's again a delusion. It's not true at all. You had a brief video from Francis Collins at the last lecture, who's director of the National Institutes for Health. He was the director of the the genome program, the human genome program in the US. So he's a strong advocate for the interplay between faith and science, and a member of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Remember what I said about creation, this idea of creation or evolution, this false choice, the false dichotomy. It's not either or, it's creation and evolution. They go hand in hand. One is scientific, the other is a faith-based teaching. Science and religion, therefore, they provide complementary worldviews, faith and reason. If we don't have the full picture, we're really looking at life in a very incomplete way. And both science and religion, then, both are dependent on this transcendent objective truth. We came across postmodernism in the last lecture, the idea that there's no objective truth and everything's up in the air. It damages both faith and science if you don't believe in an objective truth. And with that, I'm going to take us into another poll, and then we will have our a look at further reading, and then some questions and panel discussion. So if you can look at the Slido poll again, 3 questions on your takeaways from the course itself. Is it just enough insight for you? Is it too much detail? Or would you like to learn more if we had more time on a future occasion? So let's take a minute to do that, and then I'm going to ask Paul for some feedback.
Okay, we've just got the votes starting to come in. Got about another 30 seconds. There's been a few responses so far. Early results seem to be trending toward I want to learn more.
It's reassuring, Paul. Yeah. And with that in mind, so do we have enough, is it a representative sample, first of all?
We're getting near the numbers for the first one, so yes, at the moment there is 20% on just enough insight, 10% on too much detail, and 70% on I would be interested in learning more.
And with that then, I will conclude by showing you just where you might go if you want to look for some more learning on this. The amount written on it is really huge and growing, not all of it easy to follow, and not all of it consistent either. So, my first book on this, and the one I enjoyed most, was Kitty Ferguson's The Fire and the Equations. And Kitty Ferguson was Stephen Hawking's biographer. And Stephen Hawking actually, one of his questions was, what puts the fire in the equations? So this was an astrophysicist. He could not work out what was it that was putting fire and life into these fantastic equations in physics. So that is an entertaining and good book. Francis Collins, I mentioned, The Language of God, and again, brings in genetics into it. Stacey Trasancos, who's done a program for the Word on Fire Institute, and she has a number of books on the topic. And one is that science was born of Christianity. And it's really a strongly biographical book about the work of Stanley Jackie, who was a Catholic priest, theologian, and scientist. He was a PhD physicist, PhD theologian as well, and has written extensively on this topic. John Lennox is Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at Oxford. He's written a lot. This was God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? He is one of the people who's tackled Richard Dawkins quite a bit. Then on to the next group. Dawkins' most controversial book, of course, is the God Delusion, arguing that God is a delusion, and his arguments are not terribly strong. But his other books, The Selfish Gene, in The Selfish Gene he's in his competence domain. In The Blind Watchmaker, he's out of his domain of competence. Finally, of course, Alistair McGrath decided to address Dawkins, and he has a book called The Dawkins Delusion. It's quite short and quite readable, and I would recommend that. And then finally, on the topic of Alistair McGrath, he's quite a lot on the topic. McGrath has a PhD in chemistry, worked with George Rada, who went on to become the director of the Medical Research Council. And then when he finished chemistry, he decided to go back and do theology, first-class honours degree in theology, and then a PhD in theology on the end of all that. So he's one of the few people that's the authority to actually speak on both topics. So he has a textbook, not a very long textbook, but a good textbook on science and religion. And then finally a book that I enjoyed, something called The Great Mystery. And in that, he speaks a lot about our gift of being able to discern, the gift of our intellect, to be able to ask the questions, analyze the questions, and to discern really and sift through different arguments. So with that, I'm going to finish my talk, and I'd like to introduce Carmen. And Carmen is a biologist, and biology, we were talking about the wonders of photosynthesis. So I'm kind of looking forward to Carmen's perspective on this, because she sees it again from the lens of somebody from a Christian perspective, but also from the perspective of somebody that has witnessed firsthand the wonders of science, and science as a window to the work of God. Over to you, Carmen.
Can you hear me, yeah? Yeah, it's working. Well, my story can be summarized. It is probably echoes to so many people. I was brought up in the Catholic Church. I'm a cradle Catholic, as you would say, brought up in Spain. And when I was about to enter university or deciding what I was going to do for my degree, I fell out with the church. Something happened, not bad, but I just little by little I thought, oh, this is all mumbo jumbo, and God, who cares? I'm going to show myself God doesn't exist. So I went straight into science, biology. I wanted to be a zoologist, but halfway through it, I fell in love with genetics and biochemistry and botanics, and I just went into fundamental biology, which allowed me to go deeper into genetics and biochemistry. And I kept finding that this cannot just happen. There's something else here, but I didn't want to see it. I was getting so cross with myself. And I had all these academics, all these professors around me, and they were all saying, of course, God doesn't exist, science is all there is. And so, okay, if these people say so, I'm wrong. I'm seeing ghosts. And again and again and again, I was getting very, very angry. When I was with myself, I was so sure there was something else. Eventually, I came across I was introduced I came across photosynthesis. Anyone who knows what photosynthesis is basically why we are here, why we can breathe. Without that, nothing. So these little elements in the cell of plants capture the CO2 that we breathe out and the sun and the light, and it's somehow with a very sophisticated machine, unbelievably sophisticated and wonderful, creates biomass and O2. So we can eat and we can breathe through these little compartments in the cell. It's very complicated, and it has been attempted. Stacey Trasancos, who was one of the books out there, that's how she started her science. She wanted to replicate photosynthesis because that would be resolve all the issues with global warming. You can replicate that and no problem anymore. We haven't been able to do it. We can't. And that is something that really fills you with wonder. Eventually, I had to live with myself, and I was getting very angry. But there's something that I find in these atheists, atheists. They are very angry people, and I relate to that because I could have stayed there. I could have stayed there, no problem, because I could convince myself. It's very easy. It's not that complicated. If you live in that little bubble, you can believe it, and you just can keep God out. But when you go to live with yourself, and you go to and you are being honest and looking for the truth, you are going to encounter God. So I went into those 5 years of university with the intention of showing that God didn't exist, prove that God didn't, and then I encountered God there. I was very lucky because I was brought up. I was educated by these sisters who were very advanced thinkers, very progressive. They were ready for Vatican II and they embraced it. They educated us as free thinkers, respectful and loving people. That's all I got from that. So I could fall back into that, and then everything made sense. All these little puzzle pieces that were around, floating around, and I was trying to capture, they all fit in. There's still a lot of mystery. I still love biochemistry and genetics. I'm fascinated by it, and everything I read about it. But why should you deny the existence of God when everything makes sense when you do? As Stacey Trasancos says, science is the handiwork of God. And there's a beautiful way of putting it, and we shouldn't be ashamed to accept it, promote it, and tell our kids, because it is what it is, and you live very happily with yourself once you accept it.
That's very positive. Thank you. That is a very positive way of rounding off our formal part of the evening. And now we have an opportunity for some questions. We can take 10 minutes of questions, I guess, if you want to call them out, Paul. Yeah. So I'd ask Simon and Carmen to come here. And I'll stay standing. Yeah?
I think we were going to see if there was any questions first in the audience in the church. If there's not, we can go straight to the online questions. Okay. So there's one initial question here, which a clarification, which was, are you misrepresenting Dawkins' argument for the blind watchmaker? The human eye is very far from perfect, thus cannot point to a creator.
Yeah, and I think maybe it's worth clarifying that Dawkins' argument, Dawkins attacks a very easy idea that the eye just arrived and was created in its present form, whereas biology will show you that there were incremental steps. There were many examples of the elements that make up the human eye that have evolved over time. So yes, the human eye is far from perfect, and many human organs are far from perfect. But at the same time, it's remarkable how perfect they are. It depends whether you look at it as a glass half full or half empty. We won't be here forever, so things will ultimately stop working. But while they are working, I think it's really remarkable when you look at the detailed biology, the detailed molecular construction that's involved there. Yeah.
Is there any other comments about Dawkins from the panel, which I know you've both read?
Yeah, so I think, from my perspective, I think it's easy to sort of go down routes because there's a perfectly good justification for how everything can be evolved, and I think the point you said about scientism and science, there's no conflict with religion at all. Scientism is a bit like it's a belief system. It's believing in some some things that there's no evidence for. Yeah. But equally, they've got some these people who believe in scientism. They're not stupid. They've thought it out. They can think it through. But there's lots of reasons why their view doesn't make sense as well. You can look at free will disappears once you have scientism, and that's the thing. We don't have free will. We're just robots, apparently, because that's one of the consequences. The mind-body problem, you can't really explain how conscious experience appears out of the brain. There's a lot of things like those that you could look at that says it doesn't really make sense. But that starts getting into a God of the gaps argument, and there's always a chance someone will come up with a better explanation that does that. But from a Christian perspective, we don't really believe in the God of the gaps. We believe in God as the foundation of being, exactly. the where everything gets their being from. And so I think it's interesting to pick on those points of, the fine-tuning of the universe. Does it really make sense that it just appeared perfectly everywhere? I mean, there's a lot of things that would talk against the scientism, but that is a belief system, that's different from science, and I think that's an important kind of point. My thoughts, anyway.
Thanks, Simon.
Okay. Wait a second, I need to turn my computer off now. Okay. Next question would be, do you count humanism as a religion? I struggle to see supernatural religions, including Christianity, as compatible with science.
If you want to read, actually, Jonathan Sacks has a big piece on humanism in his book on morality, and Alistair McGrath deals with it as well, because I think and it's a huge topic, and I'm not expert. I've very little expertise in this other than what I've read. But one of the things I have a difficulty with is that humanism is almost promoting itself as a science-based religion. It's promoting itself as rational and scientific, whereas it isn't. And again, it lacks transcendent truth. For want of a better term, it's made up. And that's the danger. Made up by people who refer to themselves as the source, reference source. And so I think it's potentially misleading when it is put to people as better than, or more rational, or more scientific, or a better idea. And to the question then, is it like a religion? The people who promote it as if it were, but it is not.
Any other thoughts on humanism, or should we move on? Okay, next question. Evolution with no supernatural creator provides a route to elegant solutions. You mentioned glucose for energy was your example.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a good example. Yeah, it's one elegant example. I mean, there are many, and I chose glucose because I was familiar with it, and I didn't want to go into technical details, but at the molecular level, it's got a structure that is perfectly suitable to carrying energy without sticking to things and chemically reacting with things like proteins and causing damage. And it's very soluble. It's got a lot of things going for it molecularly. And if you were actually designing something from scratch, you'd say, yeah, that's going to be the one I'll use. And yet that's the one that's there. So how come when you look at things biologically, as Carmen said, like photosynthesis, and you start to work out how things work, and when you do see how things work, you think, but that's the way it should be made. There is no better solution to it. And so these are the surprises. These are the gifts you get as a scientist when you see things, you see inside things, and you understand finally that the way things are put together is really good.
That's it. I think I've spoken enough a little bit, and that's the beauty of it. Fundamentalism is very dangerous on both sides of the spectrum. Humility is the best medicine. And for scientists, when they are on the way to something which they think is great, to take a look at society, to take a look at mankind, and to say, is this going to be good or not? And then to have a body that advises them, which is outside science, which is God-infused law in our hearts. Some people are very good at getting that essence out and put it together. Maybe we would never have had an atomic bomb landing because it was science badly used and so many other things that have gone wrong. So I think the two are not only there's no divide, they need to embrace. And that's what I did. I did embrace it. And even now, I'm in awe and in love with science. But I see God behind it, and it makes me very happy and say everything is being put together very nicely. What is the problem? Yeah. I never see the problem.
Yeah. Can I have a question on about politics and science? Because I think even if we look at the news these days, there seems to be science under pressure from politics, maybe speeding things up and things like that. I don't know if there's anything you want to say about, because you came at a recent meeting, you came up with a good saying, a good phrase about science and politics.
The phrase that if you mix science and politics, you get politics at the end of it. And that's one of the risks of science, that its independence and its credibility is tarnished by political considerations that look at things in a short-term point of view. And of course, politicians want simple solutions. And sometimes they believe science will give that. Or at least if it doesn't, then you can blame scientists for the problem. And I think that's really dangerous. I think it's a big concern of scientists that you might get political interference in what is an objective, trustworthy and defensible process. That if you put politics in, you produce an impure science which would no longer be trusted, of course, and would no longer be effective. So I think it's important that the two don't mix too much. We limit the mixing of the two.
Okay, I think we've probably got time for one more question because I think we've gone over our time, and this is from our Catholic scientist. So in your list of conflicts, I don't think you mentioned the mysteries, e.g. the real presence. As a Catholic scientist, this is the top of my list.
Well, we celebrate the mysteries as Catholics. And as scientists, we also, the good scientists also celebrate mysteries. And I showed Einstein's quote last week about the universe and how wonderful the universe is. So we can, I think, whether we look at it as with a scientific lens or with a Christian lens, we can both appreciate the wonder. And it all adds up to I think, an optimistic view of the world. So we should be optimistic, but we should also be determined to keep the dialogue and keep thinking and keep working out ways in which the two can work better together.
Yeah, I think mystery is one of the things that actually can help both science and, I mean, it's something that joins us both, and sometimes, you know, the aim of scientism is to sort of pretend everything's nearly explained, and I think in nearly every age, people almost think we almost understand everything, you know, there's just this little bit and then we'll understand everything, whereas what really happens in science is every 200 years or something, things change quite significantly, you know, and I think that's what you'd expect from science, and so, you know, the embracing the mystery, I think, it'd probably make more people interested in science, you know, these anti-vaxxers and stuff, if they realise it's quite exciting, there's a lot we don't understand out there still.
We need more scientists as well, yes. So a good combination of both. So I think it's time to thank you for looking in this evening. Thanks for people who came to the church, very much appreciated, and hope that you can take something useful away from this and be more critical and analyst when you read about things in the press and when you see things on TV that are not always true. Thank you, and have a good evening and stay safe.
Just like to say a quick thank you to John for all his hard work. You can clearly see the amount of work he put in, and I think all of us who've gone along to the talks and those who will watch it later really appreciate the insights that you've given and help us to have a really, I think it prepared us, you know, for some of the questions that we get, which actually don't make any sense, that some people think it's very smart, but actually when we look into it in more detail, you see actually, you know, there are very good solutions and approaches that we can take as Catholics to our world. And to all our young people who want to do science, that's a great thing to do. You can have deep faith and you can be a great scientist at the same time. And may Almighty God bless everyone who's watching in tonight. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.